Think the Saw movies were gruesome? The Mesopotamians would laugh. Their justice system handed out punishments that made medieval torture look quaint. And if you thought gladiators were the height of brutal entertainment, wait till you hear about the Aztecs' version of game night. The Aztecs, a society built on blood. The Aztecs didn't just practice human sacrifice, they ran it like an industry. It wasn't a rare ritual, it was a daily event. If you lived in Tenochtitlan, you either watched sacrifices or became one. The empire believed the gods needed fresh human hearts to keep the sun rising. No sacrifices, no sunlight. Simple as that. The numbers are staggering. When Templo Mayor was rededicated in 1487, records claim 80,000 people were sacrificed in just 4 days. Some historians say this was an exaggeration, but even conservative estimates put the annual death toll at 20,000. That's an assembly line level of killing. The victims weren't buried quietly either. Their skulls were put on sampanli, massive racks displaying thousands of heads. The biggest one held over 100,000 skulls, a reminder of what happened to enemies of the empire. Most sacrifices came from war. The Aztecs didn't fight to kill on the battlefield, they fought to capture. Prisoners weren't just trophies, they were currency for the gods. The more captives a warrior brought back, the higher their status. A soldier who killed in battle was seen as careless. A soldier who captured dozens alive? That was a hero. Sacrifices were not quick or painless. Victims were marched up steep temple steps where 4 priests held them down on a stone slab. The executioner, using a razor-sharp obsidian knife, sliced open the chest and tore out the still-beating heart. The heart was lifted to the sky, while the body was thrown down the temple steps. But the ritual didn't end there. Some bodies were skinned, and their flesh was worn by priests. Others were dismembered, their bones used as relics. Not all sacrifices were warriors. Children were prime offerings, especially to Tlaloc, the rain god. The Aztecs believed children's tears brought rain, so priests ensured they cried before death. Some were drowned, others were burned alive. If a child had physical deformities, they were considered even more sacred and were more likely to be sacrificed. Some victims didn't go to waste, at least not by Aztec standards. There was cannibalism. The elite feasted on the arms and thighs of sacrificed warriors. It wasn't for survival, it was a ceremonial meal. Eating the flesh of a fallen enemy was believed to transfer their power. But only the high-ranking elite got to eat. If you were a commoner, you had to settle for maize. The sacrifices weren't just about religion, they were political control. The Aztecs ruled over dozens of subject states, and these regions were forced to send people for sacrifice. Imagine being ruled by an empire that demanded your family members as a blood tax. No surprise that many of these states hated the Aztecs. So when Hernán Cortés and his Spanish forces arrived in 1519, they didn't have to fight the Aztecs alone. The people the empire had terrorized for years were more than happy to help take them down. Cortés formed alliances with these states, using their knowledge and manpower to launch an assault on the Aztec capital. By 1521, after brutal battles and a devastating smallpox epidemic, Tenochtitlan fell. When the Spanish stormed the city, they were horrified by what they found. Towering skull racks, blood-stained temples, and human sacrifices still happening as the city burned. Cortés and his men may not have been saints, but even they put an end to the Aztecs' ritual slaughter. And just like that, an empire built on blood collapsed in a sea of fire, disease, and betrayal. The gods didn't save them. Maybe they were full. The Spartans, a nightmare of social engineering. The moment a Spartan baby took its first breath, it was judged. If the child was weak, sickly, or had any kind of deformity, it was abandoned in the wilderness or tossed off a cliff at Mount Taygetus. No exceptions. Sparta didn't waste resources on the unfit. Only the strongest survived, and even they weren't safe for long. Sparta wasn't a city of art, culture, or philosophy. It was a military factory. Every male citizen existed for one purpose: war. From the age of 7, Spartan boys were taken from their families and thrown into the agage, a state-run training program that made modern boot camps look like daycare. Their education? Learning how to fight, steal, and endure pain without complaint. Literacy was an afterthought. Spartan boys weren't trained to be thinkers. They were trained to be killers. Starvation was part of the program. Boys were encouraged to steal food but beaten mercilessly if they were caught, not because they stole, but because they failed to do it properly. They were also routinely whipped, sometimes to death, in public endurance trials. The message was clear: pain was a lesson and weakness was a death sentence. The violence wasn't just training, it was entertainment. Spartan boys were forced to fight each other, often to the brink of death. The weak were culled early, and only the strongest made it to adulthood. By the time a Spartan reached 20, he was a full-fledged soldier, expected to fight until either victory or death. Even then, he wasn't free. Spartans lived in military barracks until age 30, only seeing their families in secret. Marriage was allowed, but husbands often had to sneak out at night just to be with their wives. Love wasn't a priority, producing the next generation of warriors was. Then there were the Helots, the enslaved underclass who made up the majority of Sparta's population. Sparta had no economy, no industry, and no trade. Instead, Helots did all the farming, labor, and domestic work. The catch? They were treated like livestock. The Spartan government saw them as a permanent threat because, logically, if your slaves outnumber you 10-1, they're probably not thrilled about it. So how did Sparta maintain control? Terror. Every year, the Spartans declared ritual war on the Helots. Young Spartan warriors, called crypteia, were sent out into the countryside to assassinate Helots at random. No weapons, no armor, just a dagger and the element of surprise. This wasn't a rebellion crackdown. The Helots didn't have to do anything wrong. Killing them was simply a rite of passage for young warriors. The goal was to keep them afraid, hopeless, and too terrified to rise up. Sparta was the only Greek city-state where murder was state-sanctioned genocide. Spartan women lived under a different but equally extreme set of rules. Compared to other Greek women, they had more rights, but that's only because they were expected to breed soldiers. They were trained from childhood to be physically strong, racing, wrestling, and exercising to ensure they could produce healthy sons. If a woman couldn't bear children, she was considered useless. Spartan wives were even expected to share their husbands if another woman needed a child. Love? Personal choice? Not important. The only thing that mattered was making more Spartans. Despite their terrifying reputation, Spartans weren't invincible. Their rigid system made them terrible at adapting. They refused to embrace change, trade, or diplomacy. That worked until they met an enemy they couldn't overpower. In 371 BCE, the Spartans suffered a crushing defeat at the Battle of Leuctra against Thebes. This was the first time their unbeatable army was exposed as just another military force. The Thebans used innovative tactics, flanking and outmaneuvering the rigid Spartan formations. The result? Sparta's army was shattered, and their myth of invincibility died on the battlefield. The fall of Sparta wasn't sudden. It was a slow, painful collapse. Over the next century, they lost influence, territory, and soldiers. Unlike Athens, which rebuilt itself after defeat, Sparta had nothing to fall back on. No economy, no culture, no innovation, just war. And when they could no longer dominate their enemies, they became irrelevant. By the time Rome took over Greece, Sparta was a living museum, a once-feared empire reduced to a novelty for foreign tourists. The Spartans thought they were building the ultimate warrior society. What they actually built was a ticking time bomb. The same system that made them strong also made them fragile, and when it finally collapsed, no one rushed to save them. Mesopotamia, justice in the age of cruelty. If you ever find yourself complaining about modern laws, just be glad you weren't living in ancient Mesopotamia.
Hello.
This was a society where breaking a rule didn't just get you fined, it got you mutilated, drowned, or executed on the spot. Justice wasn't about rehabilitation, it was about making an example out of people in the most brutal way possible. And if you thought punishments were reserved for serious crimes, think again. In Mesopotamia, simply building a faulty house could cost you your life. The most infamous legal system of the time was Hammurabi's Code, written in 1755 BCE. This wasn't just a set of laws, it was a blueprint for state-sponsored violence. With over 280 laws, it covered everything from property disputes to murder, and its signature punishment was an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, literally. If you broke someone's arm, the government would break yours. If a builder's house collapsed and killed the owner's son, the builder's son was executed. Justice wasn't about fairness, it was about revenge, served cold, public, and with extreme prejudice. Then there were the punishments reserved for the lower classes. Wealthy nobles could sometimes pay a fine and walk away, but if you were poor, your options were limited to death, dismemberment, or slavery. They were at the very bottom, treated as property. If they talked back, they could have their ears cut off. If they tried to escape, their master could gouge out their eyes. And if a woman was accused of adultery, straight to the Euphrates River for a trial by drowning. If she survived, she was innocent. If she drowned, well, case closed. Criminals weren't the only ones who suffered. Doctors had their own high-risk profession, and malpractice wasn't taken lightly. If a surgeon botched an operation on a noble and the patient died, the surgeon's hands were cut off. There were no second chances. If you were a Mesopotamian doctor, you either got it right the first time or you never worked again. Literally. And don't think priests had it easy either. Mesopotamians took their gods seriously. If a priest misinterpreted an omen or a fortune teller made a bad prediction, they could be beaten, exiled, or killed for misleading the people. Religion and law were deeply connected, and disobeying the gods was seen as worse than disobeying the king. Execution methods were creative and public. Hanging, impalement, burning alive. Mesopotamians didn't just kill criminals, they made a show out of it. Some criminals were skinned alive, while others were buried in the walls of buildings as human sacrifices to ensure a structure's strength. If you were really unlucky, you might be sentenced to the pit of lions, where death wasn't instant, but a slow, bloody spectacle. But here's the irony. For all their brutality, Mesopotamians were also pioneers of civilization. They gave the world writing, irrigation, and organized government. But they also made sure breaking the rules meant you suffered in ways that would make medieval torture look mild. Their laws kept order, but they did it through fear. Over time, newer civilizations phased out Mesopotamian justice. The Persians, the Greeks, and later the Romans introduced less extreme, but still brutal, legal systems. But Hammurabi's code remained one of the most influential legal documents in history. Even today, the concept of an eye for an eye still lingers, just without the part where people get their actual eyes ripped out. Mesopotamians built the foundation of modern society, but they also proved that civilization and state-sanctioned cruelty can go hand in hand. And for thousands of years, nobody really questioned it. Ancient Egypt, the dark side of divine perfection. Ancient Egypt is remembered for pyramids, golden tombs, and powerful pharaohs. But what's usually left out? The fact that Egyptian elites were obsessed with the human body, and not in a way that makes anyone comfortable. They weren't just building monuments to honor the dead. They were cutting people open, experimenting on corpses, and possibly even manipulating genetics in ways that would raise a few eyebrows today. Egyptians believed the body was sacred, but to them, sacred didn't mean untouchable. It meant worth modifying, preserving, and sometimes outright dissecting. Their priests and embalmers were early surgeons, performing medical procedures that would have been considered nightmares anywhere else. They conducted brain removal through the nose, internal organ extraction, and experimental surgeries, some of which appear to have been tested on the living first. Egyptian medical texts describe procedures that sound more like a horror script than early science. Doctors performed primitive brain surgery, drilling holes into skulls to relieve pressure, though the survival rate was questionable. Some treatments involved burning wounds with fire, pouring hot resin into cuts, or applying mixtures of crocodile dung and honey to injuries. The idea was that the gods guided medicine, and apparently, the gods had a twisted sense of humor. But it wasn't just medicine, it was experimentation. Evidence suggests that prisoners, slaves, and the poor were used as medical test subjects. These weren't quick or painless procedures. Victims were often cut open while still alive, so priests could observe the effects of disease in real time. If a person had a mystery illness, their body became a science experiment. No consent, no anesthesia. Just brutal curiosity. Then there's the royal gene pool, which was more of a genetic disaster than a divine bloodline. Pharaohs married their own sisters, daughters, and nieces, all to keep their lineage pure. The result? Generations of rulers with severe birth defects, mental impairments, and genetic disorders. King Tutankhamun was a medical wreck. He had a clubfoot, malformed bones, and a severe overbite, all thanks to his parents being siblings. His family wasn't unique. Many pharaohs suffered from diseases caused by inbreeding, but the idea of marrying outside the royal family was unthinkable. And then there's mummification, the real horror show. Egyptians believed that preserving the body was essential for the afterlife, which meant removing anything they deemed unnecessary, like the brain. The process involved stabbing a hooked instrument through the nose, scrambling the brain into mush, and then yanking it out in pieces. The heart, however, was left intact, because Egyptians believed it was the center of intelligence. Let's be honest, not their best scientific guess. Organs were carefully removed, dried, and stored in canopic jars, while the rest of the body was soaked in natron salt for 40 days to remove moisture. The elite were lavishly preserved, while the lower classes, not so much. Many commoners were buried in mass graves, left to rot in the desert. But even elite mummies weren't safe. If you thought being buried in a gold-covered tomb protected you, think again. Tomb raiding wasn't just a crime, it was an economy. Many mummies were looted, burned, or even ground into powder and sold as medicine. Yes, Europeans in the Middle Ages believed crushed mummy remains could cure disease. Thousands of Egyptian mummies were turned into miracle powders and consumed, because apparently there's no limit to bad medical advice. And then there's the accidental mummies, not the kind prepared for the afterlife, but the ones preserved by pure chance. Egyptian tombs created the perfect dry, airtight conditions, which meant that some people who weren't even meant to be mummified ended up naturally preserved for centuries. Archaeologists have found bodies that still have hair, skin, and even tattoos, as if they just fell asleep 3,000 years ago. The Egyptian obsession with the afterlife went beyond mummies. Some pharaohs were buried with their servants, because why not bring your workforce to the afterlife? While other cultures practiced human sacrifice, Egyptians had their own spin. Kill a few people so they can serve the king forever. High-ranking officials, servants, and even animals were strangled or buried alive, all so their ruler wouldn't have to lift a finger in the next world. Egyptians were obsessed with preserving bodies for eternity, but the reality? Most of those bodies ended up stolen, destroyed, or eaten. For a civilization fixated on immortality, they sure did a lot of horrifying things to the living. The Incas, death as a sacred duty. The Inca Empire wasn't just a society, it was a well-oiled machine fueled by devotion, sacrifice, and a whole lot of terror. While they're often remembered for engineering marvels and vast cities, one thing history books don't emphasize enough is how they kept their gods happy. The Incas didn't just accept death, they embraced it. And if you were chosen for sacrifice, there was no escape. Unlike other civilizations that sacrificed prisoners of war, the Incas preferred their victims to be perfect, the best offerings, children. They believed kids were the purest beings, making them the ultimate tribute to the gods. This wasn't a last-minute execution. These children were selected months, sometimes years in advance, fed the best foods, and treated like royalty. But they weren't being rewarded. They were being prepared to die. The most infamous ritual was Capacocha, a state-run sacrifice system designed to ensure the empire's relationship with the gods stayed strong. When an emperor died, when a natural disaster struck, or when a new ruler needed divine approval, the Incas turned to children. These kids, often between 6 and 15 years old, were taken from their families and sent on a grueling march through the Andes. Some walked hundreds of miles to reach their final resting place, dressed in elaborate clothes and adorned with jewelry, because even in death, appearances mattered. Execution methods varied. Some were drugged with coca leaves and chicha, fermented corn beer, left to freeze high in the mountains where they would die of hypothermia. Others were strangled, suffocated, or hit over the head with a blunt object to ensure a swift death. The cold, dry climate preserved their bodies perfectly. When archaeologists uncovered them centuries later, some were so intact that they still had blood in their veins. Scans even revealed something horrifying. Some children woke up moments before dying, meaning they were aware, at least briefly, of what was happening. And it wasn't just children. Wives of dead rulers were often forced to die alongside them, because apparently the afterlife required companions. In some cases, entire groups of servants, concubines, and even officials were strangled or buried alive to accompany their leaders into the next world. If you were an elite in Inca society, you weren't just living for yourself, you were living for the emperor. And when he died, you died too. Then there was ritual cannibalism. While the Incas weren't known for large-scale human consumption like some civilizations, there is evidence that certain tribes under Inca rule practiced eating human flesh. This wasn't for survival, it was a spiritual act. Consuming part of a sacrificed warrior or priest was believed to transfer their power to the living. But sacrifices weren't just about killing, they were about control. The Incas ruled over a massive empire, stretching from modern-day Ecuador to Chile, and not everyone was thrilled to be under their control. Some subject tribes were forced to offer up their own people for sacrifice, a constant reminder of who was really in charge. If a tribe resisted, they didn't just lose a few warriors in battle, they lost their children to the priests. It was psychological warfare with a spiritual twist. Despite their brutal practices, the Incas weren't bloodthirsty for no reason. Their entire empire was built on reciprocity with the gods. They believed every sacrifice, human or animal, kept nature in balance. And honestly, their empire thrived for centuries under this system. Roads, agriculture, architecture, all flourished. But when the Spanish arrived in 1532, that balance shattered. The Incas faced not just an enemy, but an unstoppable force of disease, war, and betrayal. Their civilization, once built on divine order, collapsed within a few decades. Inca sacrifice was never seen as barbaric within their own society. It was an honor, a duty, a sacred exchange. But for those chosen, it was a slow walk toward death with no way out. Their world ran on blood and devotion, until both ran out. From Viking lung displays to Carthaginian childfires, ancient civilizations didn't just punish. They made sure you were never remembered the same way again. These aren't just deaths. They're historical nightmares, and every single one of them actually happened. The Sumerian nail impalement. So, you steal temple grain, fudge a tax record, or insult the king. In modern times, you'd get a fine or maybe a prison cell. But in Sumer, you got nailed. Literally. On a stick. In public. Welcome to Lagash, around 2400 BCE. One of the earliest documented cities with a fully functioning legal system and zero chill. Their version of crime control was short, sharp, and horrifying. The punishment? Impalement. No metaphors here. The body was hoisted onto a wooden stake, probably through the abdomen or chest, and displayed for all to see. This wasn't symbolic, it was the message. The earliest known visual of this method comes from the Stele of the Vultures, a carved limestone slab from Gursu. It shows bodies hanging like gruesome banners, lined up neatly on spikes after a war between Lagash and their farming rivals from Umma. King Eonatum led that campaign, and historians believe he used impalement not just for soldiers, but for rebels, looters, and anyone dumb enough to challenge temple property laws. And they had laws. Cuneiform records written in wedge-shaped symbols talk about penalties for everything, from tax dodging to sacrilege. Several tablets from the city of mention nailing as the outcome for crimes like defiling a shrine or rebelling against the king's word. That meant death by impalement, then public display at the city gate. You became scenery. Unlike later empires, the Sumerians didn't add flair. No ritual chants, no drawn-out speeches. They skewered you, stood you upright, and let the flies do the rest. Experts say the average person might have survived for hours, possibly longer, depending on how the stake was placed. Archaeologists found human remains near city walls that showed deliberate positioning, not a burial. These weren't accidents, they were warnings. Sumer invented the wheel and writing, but they also invented a brutal version of "don't mess with us." And thanks to stone tablets and artistic receipts, we know exactly what happened when you crossed the line. Retainer sacrifice in early dynastic Egypt. In today's job market, people quit for bad hours or a toxic boss. In early dynastic Egypt, you died when your boss did. On purpose. With ceremony. Around 2900 BCE, under Pharaoh Jer, possibly Egypt's third king of the first dynasty, the concept of loyalty took a deadly turn. Archaeologists excavating at Abydos found something that made jaws drop and spines freeze. Over 300 human graves neatly arranged around the king's burial chamber. These weren't mass burials. Each person had their own tomb, grave goods, and in some cases, jewelry. Translation? These people weren't slaves. They were high-status retainers, and they were sacrificed. Jer's tomb alone had at least 318 auxiliary burials, according to W.B. Emery's detailed archaeological reports. Some victims appear to have been strangled, possibly with linen cords, and carefully buried shortly after death. No broken bones, no signs of a struggle. Just bodies placed with precision, as if they'd volunteered to clock out of life permanent. But they didn't volunteer. These were likely court servants, nurses, cooks, guards, and even musicians. When the pharaoh died, they were killed so they could serve him in the afterlife. Think of it as an ancient office culture where quitting wasn't an option, and HR wore linen shrouds. And it wasn't just Jer. His predecessors, like King Aha, also had dozens of retainers buried alongside them. Tomb Uj, possibly belonging to the mysterious proto-king Scorpion I, revealed bodies with evidence of decapitation, not for rebellion, just for proximity to power. For 3 generations, this deadly tradition continued. Pharaoh dies, his staff dies with him, but eventually even Egypt realized this was getting out of hand. By the end of the second dynasty, Pharaoh Khsekhemwy's tomb included Shabti figurines, small statues meant to work for him in the afterlife. Plastic employees, ancient edition. Much cheaper. Much less bloody. So next time your boss sends a passive-aggressive email, remember, at least you're not being strangled and buried in his tomb. Progress. The Hittite burning ritual. The Hittites ran their empire like a strict school with a flamethrower. They had rules, hundreds of them, etched into clay tablets. And if you broke one in a way that offended the gods, fire. Somewhere around 1400 BCE, the Hittites were ruling much of Anatolia, now modern-day Turkey. Their legal codes, especially tablets from the capital Hattusa, didn't hold back. Among the most terrifying lines in the Code of the Hittites, burning as a punishment for certain religious crimes. And we're not talking symbolic burning here. We're talking actual live immolation, sometimes done in public, always with purpose. The Hittites were obsessed with purity, ritual, spiritual, and political. If someone insulted a temple, defiled sacred space, or violated oaths to the gods, they weren't just killed. They were given to the fire. One tablet outlines the punishment for desecrating temple food. The offender shall not live and be burned in a ritual cleansing. This wasn't daily justice. Regular criminals got fines, lashes, or exile. But blasphemers? They got flames. There are records of priests and scribes performing fire ceremonies where condemned individuals were burned to appease angry gods, especially the storm god Tarhunt. And this wasn't clean or quick. It wasn't supposed to be. The burning was both punishment and purification, a violent reset button. Victims were sometimes burned at the edge of temples, where offerings were made. Their deaths were meant to carry the spiritual weight of cleansing the community. It's worth noting, the Hittites didn't use this on political rebels or common thieves. This was sacred punishment, aimed squarely at those seen as spiritual threats. Think heretics, oath-breakers, and people who insulted divine order. Archaeologists have found charred human remains in and near ceremonial fire pits in sites like Yazilikaya and Alaka-Huyu. While we can't assign each bone to a crime, the placement and context match with ritual descriptions in the tablets. So, yes, the Hittites were legal pioneers. But if you ever find yourself time-traveling to Bronze Age Anatolia, here's a tip. Don't mess with the temple bread, or the gods might bake you. Tower crucifixion in Achaemenid Persia. Persia had palaces, postal systems, and some of the worst ways to die if you annoyed the king. Top of the list? Crucifixion. But this wasn't Rome yet. The Persians did it higher, slower, and with extra humiliation. Let's rewind to 522 BCE, when Darius I had just taken the throne. It wasn't peaceful. A rebel named Nidintubel popped up in Babylon claiming to be the long-lost King Nebuchadnezzar III. That went over poorly. Darius crushed the rebellion and made sure nobody forgot it. According to the Behistun inscription, a trilingual rock-carved record Darius left like a Bronze Age press release, the fake king was captured and publicly crucified. Now, Persian crucifixion wasn't the same as the Roman version. They didn't nail people to T-shaped crosses. They used wooden beams or tall stakes, often placing them high above city gates or on towers. Why? So the corpse could hang there for days, rotting in the sun, visible to everyone, a warning from 40 feet up. Greek historians backed it up. Herodotus, not exactly subtle, said Darius had tens of thousands of men crucified in Babylon after one revolt. That's not poetic language, that's logistics. Thousands of vertical poles lined up outside the city, each with a body swinging from it like some horrific fence. And it wasn't just for rebels. Persian law under Darius allowed crucifixion for soldiers who deserted, nobles who plotted coups, and even corrupt officials. According to Ctesias, another Greek source, one corrupt judge was flayed alive and then nailed to a post made of his own skin, creative HR. This method didn't end with Darius. His successors, including Xerxes, used it during military campaigns. After the failed invasion of Greece, Xerxes reportedly crucified his own engineers for screwing up a bridge over the Hellespont. Harsh Yelp review. Now, if you were climbing the political ladder in Achaemenid Persia, here's the rule. Don't fake your resume. Darius didn't just end your rebellion. He hung you on a pole and carved your failure into stone. Literally. Scapism, the Persian death that took days. If crucifixion was the Persian billboard for traitors, Scapism was the underground horror show. No spikes and swords, only milk, honey, and bugs. And it may be the slowest, grossest execution ever recorded. The story comes from Plutarch, who, in Life of Artaxerxes, gives a detailed and very real account of what happened to a Persian soldier named Mithridates around 401 BCE. His crime? He accidentally bragged that he, not the king's brother Cyrus, killed a rival in battle. Big mistake. The king, Artaxerxes II, decided to make him an example. A long, slow, squirming one. Here's how it worked. The condemned was placed between two hollowed-out wooden boats or logs, exposing only the head, hands, and feet. Then, he was force-fed milk and honey until he developed massive, uncontrollable diarrhea. The executioners then smeared more milk and honey over his exposed skin and left him floating in a stagnant swamp. The result? Insects. Thousands of them. They didn't just bite. They nested. They burrowed. They laid eggs in his skin, mouth, and eyes. Every day, the victim was cleaned up just enough to keep him alive, then fed again, and again, and again. According to Plutarch, Mithridates lasted 17 days before finally dying. 17 days. That's over 2 weeks of rot, infection, madness, and slow digestion by insects. It wasn't just physical torture, it was psychological annihilation. Historians have debated whether this punishment was common. There's no evidence it was widespread. It wasn't used on peasants or petty thieves. This was a royal punishment, reserved for people who insulted the king or committed grave political blunders. A method so vile, it didn't need to be used often, but just whispered about. And while Plutarch was Greek, other sources confirm similar punishment styles involving entrapment, exposure, and forced feeding as a form of ritual disgrace. Scapism wasn't about killing someone fast. It was about turning a man into a feast for the natural world and letting everyone know. Persia knew how to build roads, irrigate deserts, and manage empires, but they also invented a death so slow. Even crucifixion looked like mercy. Carthaginian child sacrifice. You've heard of ancient gods demanding loyalty. In Carthage, they demanded something else. Your child. And yes, this really happened. Around 300 BCE, the city of Carthage, modern-day Tunisia, was thriving. Powerful navy, booming trade, fancy purple dyes. But behind the marble temples sat a place called the Tophet. It looked like a peaceful cemetery. It wasn't. It was a ritual sacrifice zone, and most of the bodies buried there were children. Ancient writers didn't pull punches. Diodorus Siculus wrote that when Carthage faced disaster, plague, famine, military loss, they believed their god Baal-Hamon was angry. And the only way to fix it? Burn children alive, not figuratively, actually, in a bronze furnace shaped like a god with outstretched arms. You'd place the child in the statue's hands. The priest pulled a lever. The child rolled into a pit of fire. Some kids were volunteered by wealthy families trying to impress the gods. Others, historians think, were poor or enslaved. Carthaginian elites even claimed they were sacrificing surrogates, children raised for this. Nice try, the bones don't lie. In the 20th century, skeptics said Roman authors made this up to smear Carthage. Then, archaeologists started digging. What they found? Thousands of urns in the Tophets of Carthage, Motia, and other Punic sites are packed with charred infant bones and animal remains. Some were newborns, others were toddlers. Studies by archaeologist Lawrence Steger and others proved that the high number of cremated infants couldn't be explained by natural death. The bones were burned at high heat, consistent with large-scale, open-air fire pits or furnaces. And get this, many urns had inscriptions like, "Offering to Baal." No ambiguity. This was child sacrifice. There's even a chilling ritual term, mulk, used in Phoenician texts to describe the offering. It literally means a gift. Eventually, Roman forces obliterated Carthage in 146 BCE, leveling the city. But by then, thousands of children had already been given to the fire in the name of cosmic balance. The Roman poena cullei, death by sack. The Romans were obsessed with order. Kill your neighbor? You might get a sword. Kill your father? You got the sack, literally. The punishment was called poena cullei, Latin for penalty of the sack, and it was the Roman Republic's way of saying parricide is the worst thing you can do. Forget crucifixion, forget exile. If you killed your dad, or mom, or grandparent, Rome turned your execution into a bizarre animal-filled nightmare. Here's how it worked. First, you were beaten with rods. Then, you were sewn into a leather sack with 4 animals, a dog, a monkey, a snake, and a rooster. The symbolism? No one's exactly sure. The dog represented madness, the monkey chaos, the snake betrayal, and the rooster, you guessed it, constant screaming. Basically, you were locked in a screaming, biting, writhing sack of poetic justice. Once sewn in, the sack, called a culleus, was tossed into the Tiber River, or the sea if they felt dramatic. You drowned, but not before the monkey clawed your face and the snake did its thing. In Roman terms, that was total erasure. This wasn't a myth. It's recorded in the Digest of Justinian, a massive Roman law code, and referenced by Cicero, who defended a man accused of parricide. It was used in real Roman courts and carried out for centuries. Even Emperor Hadrian revived it in the 2nd century CE for dramatic effect. Sometimes, if animals weren't available, they improvised. There are records of criminals sewn up solo or with fewer animals. But the symbolism stuck. Parricide didn't just break the law, it shattered the natural order. And Rome made sure you paid for it with every squawk and hiss. It was so specific, so theatrical, and so uniquely Roman that even other brutal civilizations didn't copy it. Leave it to Rome to turn a murder trial into a zoo-themed drowning show. Slow slicing in Han Dynasty China. In ancient China, they didn't just punish you, they processed you. And if your crime was big enough, like treason, desertion, or insulting the emperor, they had a punishment to match. Slow slicing. the prototype of what later became known as Lingqi. We're in the Western Han Dynasty, around 100 BCE, when Emperor Wu was cracking down on threats, real or imagined. While the fully ritualized Lingqi wouldn't be formalized until the Song Dynasty, early Han texts already describe executions involving gradual dismemberment, piece by piece, while the victim was still alive. The official term? Lingqi, or cut punishment. It was written into legal codes for crimes that offended both the state and heaven. Unlike your standard beheading or hanging, this was reserved for traitors and especially hated criminals. Why? Because in Chinese belief, a whole body was needed for a proper afterlife. The method? First, the prisoner was tied upright. Then, the executioner would slice off the flesh in sections, starting with the arms, the chest, and sometimes even the face. Internal organs were left for last. It wasn't quick. That was the point. You died in stages, fully aware, as each cut robbed you of dignity, life, and afterlife. A few ancient commentaries mention criminals being cut into 8 pieces. Not metaphor, that was the plan, and your family, also punished. Your sons could be enslaved, your name banned from being written down. You didn't just lose your life, you lost legacy. Records from this time also describe exemplary punishments, where the condemned were displayed publicly during slicing. Townsfolk were encouraged to watch, children included. By the time of the Tang and Song dynasties, Lingqi got more elaborate, sometimes involving hundreds of cuts. But the Han set the tone. Execution is erasure, not just of a body, but of a soul. So no, the Han dynasty wasn't just about calligraphy and Confucianism. It also pioneered one of history's most methodical forms of public dismemberment. And if your final moments involved a crowd counting your body parts, you were probably already dead, in every way that mattered. Maya heart extraction ritual. The Maya gave us calendars, pyramids, and math. They also gave us one of the most efficient ways to lose your heart, literally. Because if you were a prisoner of war, or a human offering during certain festivals, you weren't walking away, you were getting carved open on an altar, while still breathing. By 900 CE, in cities like Chichen Itza and Uxmal, the Maya were performing ritual heart extractions at major temples. This wasn't some back-alley sacrifice. It was state-sponsored religion, often tied to agricultural cycles, calendar rituals, or honoring gods like Kawil and Chak. Here's how it worked. The victim, usually a captured warrior, slave, or even a high-status noble, was painted blue, a color symbolizing death and sacrifice. He was brought to the top of a pyramid, often the temple of Kukulkan, where a priest would lay him flat on a stone altar, sometimes bending his chest over a curved slab for easier access. Then came the blade. Obsidian or flint, razor-sharp but brittle. The priest would make a vertical cut through the chest, reach in and remove the still-beating heart. Yes, this is real. Spanish conquistadors like Diego de Landa and later chroniclers wrote about it in grim detail, and Maya carvings and murals back it up, showing the scene repeatedly, like a spiritual instruction manual. The heart was then offered to the gods, either burned as incense or placed on a sacred plate. In some cases, the body was tossed down the temple stairs, a final flourish to the ceremony. Fun fact? Some bodies were later flayed or decapitated as part of additional rituals, especially during ball games, where winners, or losers, were sometimes sacrificed too. Archaeologists have found human remains at Maya temples showing chest incisions, cut ribs, and missing sternums, physical proof that this wasn't just legend. It was practiced for centuries, deeply tied to Maya beliefs about feeding the gods and maintaining cosmic balance. To the Maya, sacrifice wasn't cruelty. It was currency, a way to keep the sun rising and the crops growing. But for the guy on the altar, let's be honest, he didn't care about balance. He just lost the worst lottery in history, and his heart paid the price. The Viking blood eagle. You've heard of Viking raids, but have you heard of the execution that made even warriors flinch? It was called the blood eagle, and if the sagas are even halfway true, it wasn't just a death. It was a performance. The blood eagle shows up in Icelandic texts like The Tale of Ragnar's Sons and the Orkneyinga saga, written a couple centuries after the events they describe. The setup? A high-status enemy commits treason, kills a family member, or breaks an oath. The punishment? You get turned into an offering with your back wide open. Here's how it allegedly went. The victim was tied face down. Then, the executioner used a sharp blade, probably a CX or long knife, to slice open the rib cage from the spine, separating the ribs like wings. Each rib was pulled outward. The lungs were then dragged out through the opening and laid over the ribs, fluttering like wings. Hence, the eagle. Was it fast? Not even close. The point was to keep the person alive during the process, at least through the rib carving. The ultimate humiliation was making the lungs appear to flap, while the person still gasped for air. You weren't just being killed. You were being displayed like a grotesque banner of dishonor. One of the most famous alleged victims was King Ella of Northumbria, the guy who killed legendary Viking Ragnar Lothbrok. According to the sagas, Ragnar's sons captured Ella and performed the blood eagle on him as revenge. Whether it really happened? Still debated. But the ritual pops up in multiple texts, usually as punishment for oath-breaking or regicide, the worst crimes in Viking law. Skeptics say it's a literary invention, more poetic than practical. But some historians argue it could be physically possible, if horrifying. At least partial versions of it. Either way, it was meant to terrify. There's no archaeological proof yet, no carved-back skeletons have been found, but the idea of a death so gruesome it survives centuries of storytelling? That says something. Whether fully real or slightly embellished, the Blood Eagle remains one of the darkest executions ever whispered through history. Not just because of what it did to the body, but because of what it did to the reputation of anyone who saw it. In Viking culture, honor was everything, but this was how you ended someone forever.